Welcome to day 2 of the Edge Olympics, the Summer Olympics. My guess is some of you were here yesterday, so some of these will be a repeat of what I said yesterday. But I think it's an interesting experiment that David Rowe, the chair of Edge, the postgrad program, is doing. This is the first year that we attempt this format as a way to conclude the year master programs. We'll see. We will see at the end of the week where we are, what transpired from this. but it seems to me that it's an interesting way to think in a more collective approach to this kind of conversations and to be less. And I know it's tough for us architects and designers to put our ego about the nature of the specificity of each of the projects, which I think they're all in display in that wall, and I think everybody should take a close look. I saw some of them, a little bit of it in the final review 3 weeks ago. But I think that the notion to try to engage in a broader and larger conversations seems like a potentially very productive format, and I think it's an interesting way to start to think about what is the content and the context of a postgrad education, which should be, and it is different than a B-Arc or a M-Arc. I think one would expect the postgrad to be this laboratory in which a group of people come together to produce a series of ideas and get offered to the larger community. So in that sense, I think this is it's a very interesting exercise, and see what we can get out of it. And of course, this is facilitated by the caliber and the quality of the guests that David has assembled for this 4 days extravaganza. So without further ado, I want to give the stage to David, who will go a little bit more in depth about this. But again, it's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you.
All right. So mostly I just want to restate the prompt for the discussion. Yesterday was kind of an interesting exercise in this new format. What I'm hoping for, because of how we scheduled this to coincide with this one group of students graduating and another group of students starting, is that the research and the experimentation keeps moving, that we don't just repeat it all over again, but that we could keep building on the thoughts and keep evolving it and keep pushing forward. So in the Architectural Technologies program, I think first maybe a slightly longer intro than yesterday, because it's a program that developed out of a program called ESTM, which was here before I arrived. And as we know, during the mid-90s, we saw a tremendous transformation in the technologies that are in the architectural practice. And initially, if I could try to bracket it into stages of history, the initial periods were about software, that is, how do you model, how do you render. Then came a later stage, I think, right at the beginning of the turn of the century, which was about fabrication, 3D printing, milling, then finally with six-axis robots. So the previous I guess, version of this program, ESTM, it was more focused on the robot house and how to keep increasing our knowledge and how do we build things. Now, I think we're in yet another period of history now where I think fabrication is a little bit less of an issue. And we're beginning to see other technological problems beginning to affect now not just how the architects work, but just how things are produced in general in society. So that leads me to how I wrote the prompt for our discussion here. I'll preface it by saying that the prompt did not exist at the beginning of the program. It's more me almost journalistically observing what's been happening in the program and looking for consistencies that are beginning to emerge with an eye towards how can we focus it and how do we, I guess, narrow the bandwidth of all the things that we'll look at and how to concentrate the work in certain directions. So two contemporary technologies I think are ominously transforming design today. Machine vision and artificial intelligence. I say ominously because it's a very different character, I think, aesthetically and culturally from the 90s, where there was still a kind of utopianism where software and hardware were actually going to open up all the architectural fantasies we'd had, and we were greatly looking forward to being able to use these tools. I think now it's not quite the same. I think there's a little bit more hesitation and a little bit more anxiety about the role that technologies play today. Two technologies are ominously transforming design, machine vision and artificial intelligence. Both are aspects of a general movement towards the automation of design. And I think automation, is a kind of key word for the transformation of productivity throughout society. What does it mean for a machine to see? What does it mean for a machine to think? I don't think we know the answers to this exactly. And what does it mean for designers to have a mechanized collaborator? Automation implies, I think, the production of copies. You're kind of rubber stamping constantly. To what degree because automation is based fundamentally on the problem of copies, to what degree can designers continue to then claim authorship as design industries become progressively more automated? So I think I mean something very simple about this and something we're all seeing, that as we're using more software and hardware, as technologies are becoming more and more complex, to some degree the effects that we produce through design sometimes seem like canned effects, like almost pre-designed designs that we then deploy in other ways. I think this is another way of thinking about what the general problem of mechanical reproduction that Walter Benjamin famously talked about already in the early 20th century, I think is becoming a hyper problem in the age of digital reproduction, where it takes negligible effort and negligible money to reproduce anything. So I think this is a kind of background problem of machine vision and artificial intelligence, that it is on some level connected to this general movement towards automation and the reproduction of things. So I think this is not the end of what the technological problem is, but I think this is the technological problem on the table right now. So with that, I'm going to invite Marcelo Spina up to present this year of work in the Architectural Technologies program. And just take a look at where are we in beginning to work with some of these ideas. And we'll continue with the panel discussion.
Thank you, David. I'd like to get Casey as well, since this is obviously group work. So this, we'll basically have put this stuff together and we'll try to introduce it together. I mean, before, I guess, as David sort of correctly pointed out, I think this program has been sort of around, in a different way, name for like around 5 episodes, 5 years, and this is in a kind of Freudian sense, having this kind of symposium at this particular stage where I think we're probably in a sort of transition mode and maybe like searching for a kind of new a sort of new north and trying to find new content, I think is an interesting and appropriate and maybe kind of excruciating moment to actually to deal with these issues. So, so anyway, this is a studio that ran through the summer, and it's a year-long program. It's a postgraduate program, around 12, 11 students, and the studio title specifically tried to sort of connect problems of AI, machine vision being one aspect of that, and certainly issues of automation with what we kind of characterize sort of loosely and generally as the real. And of course, one could actually take different positions on that. But this means that we've been dealing with robotics, we've been dealing with automation in somehow yet ideas of artificial intelligence, at least in the way, and Casey and I will, we're running this thing for what, third time maybe? Fourth time. And this was never really something we actually dealt with head on. And this time around, we thought because of sort of larger things, developments outside, society, and everyone knows what's going on with Google, and everyone knows even positions of people that are actually pioneering technology and their reservations they have with AI. The case of Elon Musk, who's clearly, if you think of somebody who should not really be afraid or concerned with the impact of technology, has sort of put forward, a clear amount of concerns, on the sort of development of AI. So we thought this is actually an important topic, even though it's not clear what the impact in architecture could be, to actually just put forward. And so again, automation, machine vision, these are all sort of like maybe ways in which one could actually look at AI. And in a certain way, and the issue, being at the kind of design school at SCI-Arc, being at the kind of program that at the end has always been dealing with the problems and the impacts of technology in various forms, from software to hardware to fabrication to robotics to tools to materials, but always filtered through the kind of lens of design, and design filtered through the lens of aesthetics, And so what does it mean to actually do all these things, and what does it mean to design? And how do we actually look at the problems of aesthetics in relation to these ideas of AI? So, and I'm not somebody who's completely versed on the topic of AI, and this is why I think Casey will probably go into more specific. But one of the things we kind of put forward right from the beginning in the studio was the idea, and this was something that I pretty much kind of liked and enjoyed in this movie, Ex Machina, with the idea of consciousness, the idea of what does it mean to produce something that actually will have consciousness, and means that the automation will sort of produce something beyond the kind of typical problem of automation, and what are sort of the aspects of trickery and conditions that have a lot to do with aesthetics and have a lot to do with resemblance. How do those things sort of connect with the way you make decisions in relation to aspects normally associated with conditions of beauty, let's say, or any sort of parallel to that. So this was important because at the end we were not just agents of efficiency or some form of efficiency. Our machine vision was not about a car avoiding another at an intersection, or about a sort of a typical sort of sorting of products, for some sort of distribution. This is about a different thing, and usually had to do with precisely almost sort of the opposite of automation, in a kind of a Victor Shklovsky kind of way, and I'm sure this will come out later, the idea that if you think of automation of experience and the automation of process, somehow one of those sort of two versions of automation has to sort of give way and change, so the other actually can evolve in a way. And that's where sort of the maybe the aesthetic side of this, the perception, the experience side could exist. Of course, these are all versions in where the aspects of artificial intelligence and robotics play in an interesting and sort of ambivalent role of how much these things know, how much they don't know, how much they're sort of rehearsing a sort of prescripted narrative, or how much they're just really sort of acting and they have the capacity to change. And of course, the fact that we're looking at them as sort of humans, and they have this sort of aura, they have the kind of certain sensibility that actually changes everything around it. So psychologically, it's also a kind of big thing. So, I mean, ideally, the work, and we purposely sort of left it probably more open than other years, where we were sort of being more heavy-handed on some technical things and ways of doing things, was to try and sort of put this problem almost as a form of like a mini thesis for students who had already been, trained, had studios with Peter Testa, with David, with Michael Rotondi, with Devin Weiser, seminars with Casey, myself. So I've been exposed to a bunch of people to trying to kind of bring more of their own attitude to these issues and trying to position a kind of larger set of problem in maybe larger or narrow way, in relation to a project. This is just to kind of, maybe just to talk about the fact that Casey and I had sort of shared a few of these things together and had to do with this problem of maybe machine vision. So I'll say a few more things about the site, and then I'll pass it on to Casey to describe some of the specifics of how we work, and then and hopefully we'll then go to the project. So, I mean, this is, as a postgrad, usually this is not the kind of program and the studio where students sort of look at a site, do site analysis, and then, proceed to draw a project, plans and sections, and so on. Having said that, the idea of working with the real, the idea of like trying to operate with sort of machine vision, to do light scanning, needed actually a site. And given our previous experience, including the project, for the Chicago Biennial we did with Casey together, we thought it was important to actually find something that exists, that was actually tangible, and there could not be any sort of subjectivity about it in a way. And so we took on this project, which is not far from here, an old project, Lincoln High Jail. Some students you will see, and Ferda and Rob and Marcelo might have the chance to see some of the projects are more true to this, or they had taken some specifics of the project through some of the features of it, through some of the process of machine vision. Some others have certainly kind of moved beyond. But it was important, because the problems of technology usually can go easily into a sort of techie thing, to actually make sure that this is not just that project, that there's the discussion that began by understanding the problem, but the fact that this was a place where people were incarcerated and it has a sort of physical structure, but it also kind of exists at a kind of at a confluence of various systems, that are urban in nature. And this was important because of the reading of the city and the reading of the multiple systems that are actually at play. Some of them, connected to the AI, but other ones, infrastructure and nature, are actually important into this. So all of these things somehow had something to do with positioning the site and making of the site not a kind of a sensibility of the site, but trying to begin to sort of do a, like an architect usually will get a survey of the site before actually producing a work. In a similar way, we had a sort of another form of survey to take on the existing site, the infrastructure around it, including some of the features of it. So that's the site, the Elysian Park, 2 freeway system, LA River, and including some sort of network of transportation, all in sort of close vicinity. Of course, this means something very different than what we actually will do at the turn of the century, where this will become clearly an infrastructural project. I think technology at this point and the effects of it, the fact that some of it is not physical, could have complete different effects of it. So, maybe, so this first exercise, I'll just give it to Casey to describe it better.
Okay, so I mean, this is like Marcelo said, this is the fourth year that we've run this studio. We have a tradition of kind of kicking off the semester with a very kind of prescribed workshop where we boot camp the students into a certain knowledge set or a certain kind of problem area that we want to at least influence the projects as they move throughout the semester. It's because this is a kind of research-based, not research, but it's kind of final project studio where they extrapolate within a larger brief their own particular projects. We like to have something which at least kind of constrains or focuses. So as Marcelo is saying, we are interested in the kind of potentials within this AI and machine vision within architecture and design. And part of this program, since I've been teaching with Marcelo, that we both find interesting is while this is a kind of speculative program, it's a very near speculative program where we do want the students to have a certain literal knowledge of the kind of underlying techniques that supply these kind of cultural phenomena so that they can extrapolate them into like a very direct project that has a certain literalness to it. So this semester, we began with the workshop focusing first on looking at developing algorithms which can analyze satellite photography of the site. We're interested in both the possibility of getting these kind of impossible perspectives of the site or other sets of data than a traditional survey would. And then how the kind of analysis or the sorting of that information or understanding that information the way a machine does versus the way a human does can produce alternative readings of it. So we start out, this is an example of kind of an off-the-shelf open source blob detection algorithm. We start talking, which is identifying certain regions of contrast within a satellite photograph, kind of extrapolated out as a mask, to beginning to, is this a movie? This is a movie.
Click it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Extrapolating out, and the students beginning to design very kind of simple, but obviously very kind of transformative algorithms of their own, so they begin to understand how to identify value within what the computer sees as a list of kind of hexadecimal integers that represents the pixels of an image. So not only were they looking at developing algorithms which could perceive value or elements or, in this part, kind of pieces of buildings and things within the site, they then began to kind of fold that into what would be the second half of any kind of intelligent agent or AI system, where not only does it perceive the world it's in, but also then affects it. It has the ability to read, analyze, and then contaminate, so it creates a kind of a feedback loop. So we also lectured to them about,
Well, now you have to put it to the side.
Okay.
Like,
Mac?
okay.
Clearly I'm the technical
There you go.
component.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
The students aren't working with learning algorithms, they are getting a really kind of hands-on understanding of lower level intelligent agent-based algorithms so they can begin to extrapolate into these ideas of automation within image and design production with a certain amount of literal focus. So there's some examples of the student output from that workshop. Some of them are more, let's say, surgical in their application of these techniques, and others are, say, more extravagant.
But I think an important thing with this, and obviously this is early, is the idea that of course some of these things are sort of heavily graphic, and one could kind of see this as sort of a glitching exercise. I know Casey doesn't like that word, pixel bending. It's technically the way it is. So I learned that, but the idea is that how you actually, by manipulating sort of what's given and the way you could sort of rearrange the given, could find ways to redescribe what maybe, or some of the underlying conditions that already exist in a place like this. I mean, this maybe at the level of the urban, once you go more the scale of building, this is what happened. I mean, the important thing is not to confuse this with a kind of literal graphic study to produce a sort of picture, perfect, beautiful texture, but rather to see this as a kind of substrate of a much sort of larger and possibly deeper investigation that sort of transcends into the physical, material, tectonic, but also cultural, I would say.
Yeah. So we start out with like the 2D stuff because it's easier to work with, and SCI-Arc obviously has a large tradition of representational development and investigation. But we wanted to get this year, and different from other years, very quickly into understanding like how to operate with three-dimensional information, what kind of different outcomes that would provide versus more two-dimensional image-based applications. So we took the students out and we did a LiDAR scan of the site. These are some of those point clouds from the jail, which then, and then, I just put these in because they're cool. These are from Burton's and Hita's group. They decided to put the image stuff on the point clouds too. But these are still operating as image, whereas these are kind of three-dimensional geometries. To get away from the typical trap within this work of having to wrestle with the problem of images relationship to form, we immediately began to teach them how to extrapolate the kind of 2D agent behaviors that they were dealing with into 3 dimensions, to begin to question, like, what does it mean to have a point cloud? What does having a point cloud give us as a formal operation, or what possible design outcomes could come from a more granular understanding of something versus a more traditional survey. The students began to either like voxelize the point cloud from the LiDAR screen and extrapolate them into kind of three-dimensional solid-based agents. These are two examples of this process. But also, some of the groups, we also translated that point cloud into a mesh, so they could also begin to look at like how they could use these sorts of algorithms for operating on discrete elements. So looking at how these types of things can not just violate or manipulate a pre-existing form, but also then begin to add kind of precise assemblage-based logics on top of that geometry.
I mean, one interesting point on this project you'll see on the project later is that when we did the light scanning, I think we did it from sort of two sides, so there's a bunch of points that basically stick to the building, and then the trees are covering some portions, so you get like, you get certain sort of almost accidents and errors of the very same process in which you're actually measuring these things, so it's sort of an inaccurate survey that already produces some inherent sensibility that some of, I think some of this studies, early work, begins to sort of look at more a more focused idea of what some of those permutations could be, which inevitably sort of looks like infrastructure or resembles infrastructure. It's impossible not to see this thing as some sort of mechanical device that actually sort of attached to building with complete disregard of aesthetics, let's say, and you could see some of the things out there. So I think it's sort of beginning to look either through resemblance or through purposely estranging conditions to begin to look for opportunities as to what these things could do in the context of actually of this building, let's say.
Yeah, and as the final thing, they began to, again, as this project it was not about operating in a vacuum, and as the projects go forward, you'll kind of see that the final step of the process was producing these kind of recomposited images of the two exercises. So having to put their three-dimensionally transfigured or assembled objects back into the two-dimensionally transfigured context that they came from. So it's about sensing the context in the building and then using it as a driver to retransform that, at least at the state of the image in this case, but also in the models as you saw before.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, all this, and this has probably been there, for kind of since the beginning of this program, the idea of either assembly or a form of discrete assembly, or the relationship between that discrete assembly could have with like genres that are probably on the opposite side, like sort of monolithic form or abstract form, or things that are sort of produced not in a sort of bottom-up way, but sort of top-down. And even the sort of relationship with, the kind of philosophical relation that one can find between, let's say, what would be the sort of triple O approach to the object as sort of a kind of more essentialized condition versus a more, maybe for a more materialist approach to the object, where the object's actually kind of made through a kind of process of accretion. These two things are still probably at play in some of the work, and so the natural tendency of all this work in terms of how to actually take the more graphic or linear or pixel-based, point cloud-based, and then translate it to problems of assembly or problems of discrete assembly is clearly at the core of most of the work, probably not all.
I think certainly within that first exercise and that type of the way of working, one of the kind of philosophical territories we lectured to the students about outside of the triple O is the speculative realist kind of Prometheus nihilism of Ray Brazier, not giving any kind of philosophical hierarchy, but there's a lot of overplay there where the fundamental project that they're dealing with is we receive a lot of meaningless information. How do we reconstruct or structure significance out of that information as a kind of fundamental design project?
So, I mean, I guess some of you had a chance to talk with students about the work. So now I'm going to pass this and I'm going to hit the animations. Or yeah, yeah, okay. So we'll just offer some pointers on the work, which is obviously the kind of reason we're here, and we're like super thankful and respectful to all the students who've done like fantastic work throughout the semester, all the way until like a few hours ago. And So crypto architecture, I mean, this is weird. It's actually kind of a sort of hardball that David threw all of us, which is having to not present the studio, but present the work, which is usually the thing you get away not doing when you actually are, when you teach. And so I guess we'll probably do, we'll have a more sort of journalistic, to use David for attitude towards the work, which is different than the way probably the students will. So this is Jose and Daniel, project that is located right there. You'll see the model. It's actually quite a fantastic model. I think for me, I think what's interesting about the project, and in the previous discussion, I heard further talking about metabolism. We certainly talk about high tech in the studio. Is how this project, they're interested in sort of like producing a project that will have a kind of like almost like a sort of like a server side, a huge sort of solar farm at the top, and some component of housing, and in a sort of more peripheral place like this, at a kind of at a sort of edge, at an urban edge, and how that project sort of begin to kind of coalesce with these ideas of infrastructure that sort of began with these kinds of stuff, which is basically, and I will defer to Casey for the specific, but it's basically a version of something that will otherwise be completely two-dimensional. And this is probably 2.5, not fully three-dimensional.
It's 3D.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like
this is an
volume.
elevation, so it looks flat, but...
Yeah. So what's interesting is that these guys, I guess, probably early on in a more sort of parasitic way, and after in a sort of much more comprehensive way, began to almost attack this building by basically positioned with this sort of circuitry, from the exterior that will give the building kind of necessary infrastructure to actually have, I don't know how many servers inside there, and this is what the specifics that are better described by the authors. What's interesting about this thing is actually it is a kind of form of infrastructure, but it's not the kind of infrastructure associated with freeways or roads and so on, or bridges, but it's just a kind of more hidden infrastructure that you rarely see, and that in this case gets sort of heavily aestheticized by the kind of pseudo-parasitic, invasive presence of these pieces all around, and certainly internally in the building with the kind of solar thing. I know there's a side of it that, the economical side of it, which is, that's maybe...
Well, this project was pretty interesting for us because it took what was a very kind of formal exercise of aggregation of these kind of discrete immutable blocks together into an extrapolation when they started to begin to program as an architectural program, not script. The final project, they wanted to take this kind of part-to-part relationship as the basis for rethinking housing typology. So these guys got into researching kind of blockchain and wanted to begin to propose a residential typology that was driven by kind of blockchain contracts or decentralized landlords, and at the same time looking at how to start to get some kind of cost-benefit trade-offs because of the kind of housing cost crisis in Los Angeles about if you began to integrate servers and mining computers for blockchain and cryptocurrency as part of the residential development. So whenever you add a unit, you're also adding computational power, but that means you're also adding energy consumption and pretty significantly heat. So these guys kind of went through a whole series of layers about looking at how this kind of decentralized contract for development could begin to create an alternative economic model for the residential project, where there's a real kind of physical consequence and an aesthetic consequence, but also kind of organizational consequence of the symbiosis of all of these systems together within the project. So those are early loose paradigms or models they did. These ones have kind of more specific passive cooling chimneys, which is exciting territory for this program. So there's some chimneys, solar panels.
Some plants.
So they took I think that these guys did an excellent job of extrapolating a fairly directed kind of formal exercise initially into a project which has maybe larger consequences typologically and
Yeah, and I think that I mean, I don't know, this is a project that we are quite interested in because I think it kind of just situates itself in a sort of balance, I mean, not balance as a kind of average, but balance approach to the problem of aesthetics. Of course, the aesthetics all over it. In fact, you know, some of the main kind of discussion and criticism to the students being the kind of maybe the lack of accountability for the aspects of aesthetics in the project, and you know, given all these other issues. But it's also the aesthetics is somehow somewhat controlled. It's not. It doesn't seem to be everywhere. In fact, you know, the project is sort of stratified. It seems kind of at ease, having the almost a kind of collagistic approach to different systems that somehow transcend into one another without much fusion, without much like variation. They basically, you know, one ends and the other one begin. And I think there's something into that project that brings a certain plausibility about what this could be, given all these other aspects and ambitions, you know, I would say probably cultural ambitions that the project sort of positions. So I mean, definitely invite you to sort of look at the model, which is actually a fantastic piece. Actually, this is a piece, this is a photo. This morning, I think, right? Yes, thank you. So, okay, this is Resurgence, Mohib, Hsiao-Chiao, and Shabnan Morajevi. I guess if there is one project that maybe like stays true to some of the early, I would say glitch images or kind of diagrammatic glitch images, line work, and some of the most probably arbitrary and yet completely beautiful and an amazing set of drawings. This one, you know, it's like when something like this happen, you know, in a kind of in a sort of kind of epicenter or node as this building has in that area, and the kind of whatever the distortion that begin to occur, we certainly sort of were pretty adamant about trying to actually come to terms with this. You know, what would it mean, you know, for this thing to actually become more than just a 2D drawing and so on. I mean, in a very maybe more traditional sense, you know. And I think these are some of the kind of healthy differences that we actually see in the studio, that the approach to tools, technique, and the sensibility by which, you know, every student kind of relates to them is different, and it's a kind of case by case. So I mean, I can't remember the program. I don't think the program was there's a train station, right? There's a, you know, but basically there's kind of there's an approach to actually optimize by sort of like eat away portions of the existing building to basically make the building, which is kind of a monolith, sort of lighter, to bring more light, to bring more, to bring kind of bigger and more differentiated fenestration through the process of almost like, you know, engineering optimization. And then from there on, other sort of forms of abstraction that actually had a lot to do with the sort of early kind of drawing began to kind of filter through different ways of assembly, or even like just subtraction of material through, you know, but were otherwise sort of more monolithic and smooth surfaces. And I think we had I'm gonna find the animation, which is probably better explain all of these things.
I think like within all the projects, as David was mentioning, as automation becomes a aspect of the design project, is it's up to one of the kind of central things is defining the hierarchy and relationship between the human author and the machinic. And I think in this case, this group kind of opted to work with the automated aspects of the project in a very constrained way. So using them to produce like a texture, or using them to produce a kind of surface map for structure, but always keeping those in a very kind of constrained territory formally, where it became more about layering or application intuitively or in a painterly way from the designer's point of view, rather than maybe allowing, like in the previous one, the rules for an organization to define the aesthetic of the project.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, to those, you know, I think discussions around like either the sort of early Saha painterly approach to Malevich paintings, or even like the micromegas from Daniel Livingston. How will you actually make of something that innately has a sort of expressive material, not to become just a purely kind of gut-driven project, but rather actually, a seemingly far, much more, not rigorous, but let's say automated condition where you're making decisions, but you're not just like painting in a kind of more traditional sense. I think some of the questions still remain in the project, and the approach probably to like, I don't know how you slide it because
You have to stay up here.
yes.
There we go.
There you go. Beautiful. But it's probably one of the. I think the condition of the project where I think the project is still, it's still maybe ambiguous and maybe beautifully ambiguous is the relationship between the sort of painterly or the differentiation between color and the differentiation between material and maybe variations of or conditions of assembly as not being completely clear as of relation to color. And this is maybe a kind of productive territory for actually for students to pursue. Tiwa Chen, this is half, yeah. I mean, titles are obviously sometimes overrated. So I think this project really, it's probably could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be in this building. I think it takes building as a site of experimentation for the problem of this kind of excessive and recursive and incredibly redundant assembly of sort of self-similar parts to both kind of attack at an existing almost a scaffolding structure in the interior that then takes on the exterior, that then begin to actually eat away the existing building to almost produce moments where the existing facade and fenestration disappear, to moments where the two structures are actually kind of almost coalescing, with each other. Some of the ideas had to do with how to actually be sort of productive with this sort of system to enable for more freedom with the least amount of possibilities to allow for other systems such as stairs or circulation of movement to exist, but in a sort of more hypothetical, speculative way, where basically you're kind of producing a construction that is leading to a kind of ruination of a sort.
Yep. I think you got it.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, this is obviously a very kind of a very specific and tectonically myopic project. I think a lot of the focus was just looking at how a part could begin to engage envelope versus volume as he automated those processes or looked at how to develop that kind of intelligence in the system.
CWAS model is actually a large one right over there in the corner. Biophilia, Burshin, and Sahita. I mean, I'll preface this, which is like, you rarely see a green project at SCI-Arc, and this is something that I thought it deserved to be pushed. Of course, it had to take its turn. It could not just be a green and assertive project. It had to be dark in some way, even though it looked green. But it was important, let's say, Casey and I were discussing earlier, as we kind of begin to look at topics and content for a project of technology, of architectural technology, which is not a kind of dogmatic, say, we do robots, or we all do this, or we do advanced materials, what are the sort of pressing issues that are out there that maybe you can apply technology to and change the problem in and of itself. But the problem itself is not it's not the most sophisticated thing. Let's say the problem of, I don't know, green, or how to incorporate green, or how to deal with what, as the students describe, the problem of the wilderness, especially in a place like California, where our urban condition is not the sort of typical urban condition, and you have animals, you have even wilderness as assumed by even the city as something that needs to be actually dealt with. So these students sort of took this approach and decided to actually make of the building a kind of a sort of progressive, not a ruin, but a ruin that would actually be taken over by a kind of system that will support greenery, but also will sort of control itself. And I'll defer to Casey to explain the mechanism for how this happened, and in which we'll use robotics to somehow legislator govern the sort of growth and the necessary sort of killing of species as it actually kind of move forward.
Yep. Next one.
Yeah, this one.
These guys. So this project, again, obviously has its kind of trajectory and history in the original exercises from the first part about how to begin to formalize a point cloud into geometry. We then began to extrapolate in this idea of producing a product which was a kind of prefabricated smart component that could be assembled to produce these mini wildernesses within the domestic environment. And we began to extrapolate the idea into how integration of AI could begin to actually introduce something that historically within architecture has been pushed out. I think pretty much within the history of architecture, we're looking at sequences of moving the domestic or the interior further and further away from us until that wilderness or that dangerous unknown becomes something that's kind of compartmentalized. So these guys are looking at the idea that if you have a smart component that can, at a micro level, continuously sense and manipulate what otherwise is a kind of free-for-all growing environment, or even potentially accelerate that growth environment within the domestic space, that it allows for greater biodiversity, or potentially like pharmaceuticals and things which would normally be unable to share the same kind of space as a living room, could start to become managed. So you start to bring that threshold between the unknown and the known closer together. So each one of these parts has a little, or has a kind of sensing systems, pumping systems to output nutrition, poison, and water into it with an autonomous sensing and growth. This looks like kind of charts for deployment. And a catalog of the componentry.
I mean, I think the idea of, and David spoke clearly about the, how sort of interesting fabrication has maybe not ceased, but sort of maybe wind into other interests. However, the idea of sort of fabricating and automating that fabrication vis-a-vis the robot house or some sort of alternative situation that implies that is still important to us, and for some students come with their own agenda, and this is actually important, and we value that. So in this particular case, it was important to actually have the students sort of take on this and try and build, larger prototypes, maybe quite a bit large in the example we have in the gallery now. And they even tried this thing. This is not a montage, didn't quite work. That's why we, that sort of move away from it. But there was actually green there, which of course didn't grow because I guess green and sire don't quite get along. But it was there for a while, So okay, now again.
I got it.
Beautiful. Robotic assembly, I guess. Yeah. Sohan. So this is probably one of the most sort of like really, really, really myopic project, which again, I guess the site is there to begin with, but then it sort of goes away. And it really, I mean, I guess it probably could kind of belong to a family of other projects that exist out there, some Grammatio color that have to do with this, like aggregation of pieces and problems of growth in a way where, like, the assembly is not leading to something you already have full control right from the beginning. That's what I would say, but I mean.
Yeah, I think this is like a very specific project looking at, we'll get into the examples in the robot house here, where he began to look at, a really specific aesthetic, formal production and kind of procedural production of alternating between aggregating these kind of interlocking components which just kind of fall loosely into a pile, and then utilizing a more tensile materiality to tie them together, and specifically jumping jacks and nylon, but the idea of beginning to play with kind of loose, rapidly deployable kind of compression elements within, within a construction system, and how you could begin to then overlay precise, let's say, robotic tool paths, but then the material agency of the plastic and gravity and the interplay between the aggregated elements and the fibrous elements produce something other, something kind of Gothic in this case.
I mean, I think in many of the projects, the problem of the part, what is the part, is something that the designer really has full control, that it actually has to become something that he designs, he or she designs. In this case, Sohan was using a part that he had made, you know, kind of in the spirit of a sort of three-dimensional jack, or the idea that there's enough things in the world that exist that one could actually get and redeploy and be familiarized for whatever context they're actually being used for, and try and actually get them beyond that context to produce a complete different effect. And in that requires a certain knowledge, you know, a knowledge of whatever hardware and even like, you know, what to buy and how many of these things and so on.
Yeah, like beginning to really like kind of add functionality into inexpensive and easily sourced, kind of serially produced parts.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So okay. Finally, yeah, the title's not a typo. You can ask the authors, you know, about the background. So anyway, so I guess, you know, we started talking about like machine vision, and this is obviously something that will come up again. I think this is really a project of representation, and it's about it's representation for representation, and I think this is something we had quite actually probably a bit of discussion in the studio, and to be transparent about it, you know, with all the respect to the students, because I think they always had the right hand in terms of like what they wanted to pursue, and I think this was important, and it was important to us that they actually pursue it as well, you know, so, I mean, this is probably a project that it's harder for us to describe because it's really kind of author-driven, but it really has to do with the problems of aesthetics associated with mechanisms of using this digital craftsmanship that they decided, you know, in relation to the kind of robotic environment as means of both design and manufacturing at the same time, and how the process of feedback between those things could actually begin to have something to say. I mean, in our sort of journalistic view, there's obviously quite a bit more than that, because there's obviously a kind of hand to design in the more abstract sense of the world, and, you know, being completely unapologetic, and we are, you know, even though with differences and degrees, supportive of it, you know, and but so these are some of the images associated with this. I think it's one of the projects that probably in you know, with all the nice features of the physical model that we're super happy to see, is best kind of described through images that are themselves kind of hybrid between you know, repurposes of existing photos through light scanning, through projections of using the robot house, and coloration that the students sort of took on to produce these kinds of things, which in and of themselves is sort of hard to see what will they have to do. But I have to say it's quite important that the students sort of had the way to completely remove this thing from the context of the project. You know, it's a project that exists almost in autonomy, although it still has a mass, it has a form, and it has a lot of aesthetic predilections and decisions that I think it would be interesting to, you know, to further discuss. But
I think this project, like very literally, took on this kind of complete loop of perception to production and the brief. The system they set up with the robots, well, initially the project using the LiDAR scan to extrapolate into form, kind of misappropriating techniques from photogrammetry to generate massing, which we can see here, and kind of like weird perversions of traditional kind of or disciplinary architectural geometric operations like extrusions. And then they began to transpose this into a really literal collapsed physical digital space where kind of working with some platformers that we've been developing for a while. They'd also been working with them in previous semester seminars. They set up a loop where a robot was continuously scanning a surface, developing toolpaths based on that scan, and then modifying that geometry. So they used this both as a milling process, where they were, again, because of their interest in kind of representational techniques, they really dialed back the sorts of behaviors that we had been working on in the past to purely begin to extrapolate or express color information or shadow within the form. And then they also began to, so then also after the production of the form, they began to utilize the same operational setup to paint the figure or apply the same sort of coloration effects that they were getting in the point clouds, and with the weird photogrammetry and the weird lighting effects, very little on the final object. And I think there was a pretty good comment today by Rob where it's the first kind of digital object he's seen, where the thing that he's looking at looks like something that would come from, that we'd expect to see in the computer, but not into the actual physical world. So it's and also kind of going back to the kind of conversation about hierarchy and authorship within this system, like these guys really constrained the way the data structure works so that it would express this intent about representation that they had. We're exposing the underlying structure, in this case, the kind of voxel grid that typically I use to line up scanners with behaviors and robots, but then it disappears within the work. They kind of pulled it out as a part of the aesthetic agenda.
Yeah.
That's our
Yeah,
last
I mean,
one.
I think this is it. You know? Keep this looping,
Yeah, how do we do that?
or I mean, we'll see. Or maybe we can have Agustin also punch some of them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Agustina. We get the maybe the title.
However you want.
How many of us are there? Just one more.
I think you can.
Yeah,
You guys. DJ.
you sorry.
All right.
Dark.
There's a lot to talk about here, I think. Maybe we could circle back to do more like targeted questioning in my role as moderator, but maybe we start from something a little bit more anecdotal and we can loop back to the more pointed questions. Before we jump into it, just quickly introduce everybody. We have Marcelo Gao, who's faculty here at SCI-Arc. She teaches history theory courses, design studios, and is currently the undergraduate thesis coordinator. Marcelo and Casey, you just met. We have Rob Stuart-Smith, who's coming to us from now closer in Philadelphia from the University of Pennsylvania School of Design. Previously, he was at the DRL at the AA in London for quite a long time. He's now going through a painful tenure process, right? You just started. We're so happy you're in the States now. Rob's done a lot of interesting work with technology over the years, particularly with fabrication. Just before he left London, he successfully applied for and acquired a very, very large grant through the University College of London for aerial additive manufacturing, right? So basically 3D printing with drones, which is kind of a spectacular idea. He is principal of Rob Stuart-Smith Design, right? And was also one of the founders with Roland Schnooks of Kukujia, which is a pretty well-known thing in the world of cool design, you know. Then his colleague at University of Pennsylvania, and as we say in the mafia, a friend of ours, Freda Colaton, who has been teaching at University of Pennsylvania for a long time. We were actually there together nearly, 15 years ago, gasp, right? He is now one of the practice professors at the University of Pennsylvania, which is quite an honor. There are only 3 there, right? And they're well-known figures. And he's also principal of SU-11, the architecture practice based in Brooklyn. I want to, last time I saw Ferda, we were driving around in Germany, and I guess because we were in a car, we started talking about automated vehicles, you know, like cars that drive themselves. And the Pharisees say, "Oh, I just saw something last night on public TV where there was kind of a fascinating ethical debate about this technology of automated vehicles." Now, it's I think, a good way to start to think about all the strange questions that might ultimately be at stake. Because in the problem of the automated car, you have these two technologies. The car needs to be able to see, and if it sees poorly, people will die, as the first Tesla death was. I believe the car scanned the side of a tractor trailer, which was blue, and it couldn't distinguish between that blue and the blue of the sky, and just went full speed right into the truck. While the passenger was apparently watching a Harry Potter movie, apparently. Yeah. And also, it needs to make a decision. Even if it does see, it needs to make a decision about stopping the car or turning it or interacting with other vehicles. Right now, there are very few of these on the road, but if every car on the road is somehow automated and intelligent and can see, then the decision-making is kind of a crucial problem. So I wanted to ask Ferda if you could tell us about what he saw on German public television that evening.
Sure. It was actually radio, not that it really matters, but what was really interesting about it is that, so Germany is fully committed to embrace a future of driverless cars. And it basically wants to go fully ahead, sanctioned by the government, to lay out the trajectories to, in 10, 15 years, have driverless cars. And Germany, for those of you who don't know this, is a highly regulated country. People here would call it socialist. So basically, the government makes decisions how this will actually roll out. And what they were talking about in this radio program was that the government had put together a group of people who would have to make decisions how the kind of driverless car scenario would work under sort of legal, social, and ethic viewpoints. And in this panel, they had chosen to include two politicians, two philosophers, and two priests. And
It's almost like a joke.
Yes.
Set up for a joke.
Right, and they very seriously, one of the questions they were trying to solve prior to actually going into this sort of new world of machines making decisions is, if a car has to hit an obstacle, and that obstacle is a human, and if there are two obstacles and the car needs to make a decision which one of those to hit, how do we decide that? Right? So basically the point is, a car is actually driving and it cannot escape, it has to hit one of two obstacles, both of them being humans. How does a car decide which human to hit? And they basically built up a scenario, and they said, in that scenario, well, what if one person is an 80-year-old man and the other person is a 5-year-old child, right? And so the panel was trying to decide what the car should in that moment actually do, right? And then so you would program the car to actually hit either the old man at the end of his life or the young child. And what was interesting in the discussion is that everybody except the priests would say, well, it should hit the old man. Common sense, right? So you just basically, and the priests would say, no, we can't do that because that's sort of, divine intervention, and there's no way that we can make such a condition. And then we were in this conversation, we were actually thinking about it. What is really interesting about that also, aside from who should be hit or not, is the priest's argument is basically to say, well, let's randomize an algorithm. Mm-hmm. So the cars will hit, left and then right and then right and then left and then left and then right, mm-hmm. and so forth, right? And therefore, the computer takes on the role of sort of divine decider, right? Mm-hmm. An algorithm. Mm-hmm. And the priest would be totally, without any irony, they thought that that was the right thing to do, without any it was baffling in so many ways. But I think what's interesting, and I believe that's why you're bringing this up to start the debate here, is of course it's not only an ethical question, even though what does only mean? That's a very big one. But also, a question in terms of liability. Who would you sue if the car makes a certain decision and somebody gets hurt? Through what channels would you actually expedite lawsuits? And how does that kind of new world establish itself or materialize itself?
I think you and I were absolutely fascinated and I mean, it's almost like you laugh because you either laugh or cry, The point of view of the priest, that the answer was, I expected you were going to tell me, and then the priest said we should not have driverless cars. But the answer was we need a great random generator. That there was a kind of bizarre theological dimension to unknowability and to have some mechanization of unknowability. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And to some degree, I thought and that's why precisely why I wanted to start with this. I think in this, during this year, exploring these two topics of machine vision and artificial intelligence, just as a very modest, opening move of the chess game. Because as we know, this isn't like deep AI of any sort, and it's barely machine vision, right? Or it depends on how we define what machine vision really is, right? It really depends on how we define these terms.
It's machine vision. It's just not particularly sophisticated machine vision.
Okay. So with that, I think there was, in this question of what is the agency of the designer, I think there was a reliance on a concept of defamiliarization, which is, I think, addressing the need for uncertainty, ultimately, that it produces something new or something that was not premeditated or that it wasn't already figured out by the methodology or the technology, that somehow the technology or the method is being pushed to produce something almost like an error. But it's not exactly an error because it's exactly the outcome you were hoping for, right? So there is, I think, some relationship to maybe the theology of the uncertain or to the random, or maybe it's not so random after all. Maybe these are not the right concepts, right? So I think as we try to sort a little bit what we mean more precisely about machine vision and AI, before we get into the more nerdy stuff, maybe we could put on the table maybe some possible concepts for dealing with it. Even if it's just arriving at some consensus about, is this a project of defamiliarizing the outputs of technology? Do we all agree? I mean, is that sufficient? Is that enough of a method? Yeah.
Well, one thing that really struck me with the prompt, I think a couple of words that really jumped out were the collaborating with the automated partner, and also the word ominously, funny enough. Because I was wondering, a few days ago I was reading this recent text, which I think makes an excellent contribution to this discussion, by John May, in the most recent issue of Log. It's called Everything is Already an Image. That text, he begins to talk about the difference between what we conventionally refer to as a drawing, a photograph, or an image. And he breaks it down really, in a very, very astute observations about how there is a kind of fundamental category error when we sort of associate things that we call images today with things that we also call photographs, because there's a kind of resemblance between them, although they're completely predicated upon different logics, different techniques. And I think that it does raise the question, and the word aesthetic came up multiple times in the presentation, especially Casey and Marcelo. I think David also referred to aesthetics. And I wonder, coupling that with this idea of defamiliarization and uncertainty, and I'm wondering what this then does to the notion of aesthetics, and if we can still talk about as sort of, the post-digital aesthetic. The other thing I just wanted to throw out on the table I thought was really poignant when David brought up the issue of the ominous, that this sort of anxiety, do we agree that we are in a position again today, as we were in 1932 with, I'm thinking of Techniques in Civilization, the book by Lewis Mumford, for instance, followed up 20 years later. For 20 years, they're thinking about this kind of anxiety by Jacques Ellul with the Technological Society, where the assumption was that a lot of the value systems that would be developed out of the techniques, not with a Q-U-E-S, but technique, T-E-C-H-N-I-C, which is something that one would argue that a technique couples a kind of moral and political stance with technology. So it's very different from just technology on its own. So anyway, those kind of issues, I think, are really tied to what David's raising with the
Well, I purposely avoided using the word aesthetic, but in some sense, I think my emphasis on the word ominous, I think that's an aesthetic judgment, to say it's ominous.
I want to maybe just, I want to let these guys kind of flex a bit because they're our guests. But the ominous thing I have a bit of a problem with, and maybe it's a generational thing, maybe I spend too much time in the weeds, but I think the argument that the priest is having in the first place is an argument from a position of luxury. The fact that we're hanging up on this one incident is allowed through the fact that when autonomous driving comes into existence, it's going to vastly reduce, it's not going to go into place until it vastly reduces the amount of vehicular homicides or vehicular deaths in the first place, right? So even this kind of moral conundrum that it is where it is already a vastly improved state to where we are from a kind of economic, safety, commercial point of view altogether. And then there's the other side of it. The priest has the kind of theological background to make this a kind of, it doesn't matter to him. Either one can die and then it'll get sorted out afterwards, which is not a position that maybe everyone would share. He has a theological safety net.
Well, I thought
I don't want to go down that road.
The point was, whether it's 1,000 versus 1, you still can't make the choice. And I thought that was a very interesting theological point of view.
But I think it's a
But just the
theological point of view
deciding
that
is
necessitates
problematic.
a belief in the afterlife.
Yeah.
I think that if we want to talk about what these machines are being designed for and what they're good for, which is kind of leading to where I want to go in terms of the aesthetics, is that it's about an increased productivity or increased performance for somebody. So I think within architecture, maybe where the defamiliarization has become something interesting to us is there's a kind of capital certainty to these types of systems being deployed throughout our profession. They're great at classification, so you can begin to roll through huge chunks of the professional workflow. And I think there are some large companies which are already beginning to do that. So what I think that we have to do as designers is begin to understand that this territory is not something we can decide is coming or not. It is the kind of new territory, it is the new normative of existence. And what we're looking at is what opportunities for transforming design do these systems allow? In the same way that kind of Corbu looked at concrete, or in the 90s, you guys were looking at the invention of CAD, or 3D modeling software and animation software. So there's a little bit of this question, while it's maybe we're obsessing too much with defamiliarization, I do think it is a kind of obvious route into understanding what the kind of design consequences of a system or a way of operating that will become, say, normative for us can begin to exert on the cultural project.
Just to expand a little bit on Casey's comments and David's, there's now a ubiquity of algorithms operating in our daily life that we actually never question the hierarchy of decisions those algorithms are programmed to have. So whether you're searching on Google or shopping on Amazon or determining which ride to take on an app on your phone, there's a whole sequence of algorithms that we're completely dependent on that are now taking over from what used to be a conscious and subconscious process that we went through daily in our personal experiences. And I think the car just raises that issue of how much we should actually have access to those decisions that are being made on our behalf? Like how transparent should those algorithms be? How participatory should we be in that process versus, the kind of closed black box scenario where they're run by individual companies that don't have scrutiny? And there's no easy answer to that. The actual car problem I find a little bit, it's a nice conundrum, but I imagine the chances of that decision being incredibly minimal because there would be a lot of logical things that you could put in place beforehand, such as a minor variation in the vector of the car might make one of the maneuvering away from one of the people much easier than another one. It would be a very rare circumstance where they're equally probability of being able to be evaded, So, of course, it doesn't get rid of the conundrum ethically, but I think that it's a really what I was going to say.
I gotta jump in here because I think
It's interesting that Casey and Rob sees it as a false problem.
no, but also it's also interesting that they see it as a problem that can be fixed with further technological advancement, right? And therefore, sort of continuing the sort of 200-year-old tradition of if like it gets better and better and better, which may be very well the case. It's not even, I don't even want to necessarily argue that, but I think the reason why I find this story interesting is because it opens up a much larger field for debate than the one we're, I think, engaging right now. So to me, it's not about like it's the right thing, the wrong thing, or moral or not moral, but that these discussions in a very serious way in a country like Germany are taking place, to me, in and of itself, is really what fundamentally makes this kind of stuff be richer and more interesting. Not the other way around. Not the other way around. So I think we should jump on these kinds of questions. I mean, where you take it, if you sort of take a conservative or progressive side on it, that is everybody, its own decision. But as you said, Casey, it is the new normal, and the new normal comes with social and political and ethical and all these kinds of questions. And there's no doubt there are probably ways of making sure that the machine gets smarter and smarter. But these things will happen. There's no doubt about it. They may happen in a sort of smaller scale. That machines will take on more and more agency is clear, right? I don't think anybody would argue that. And I think the moment you accept that, all the other questions come around. To me, one interesting question for myself to ponder is, can we actually take our own ideas of ethics and put it on technology, right? Which seems to be absurd, but that's kind of what we do. Maybe we cannot do it any other way. Even when we talk about machine vision, when we see how does a machine see, we all know a machine does not see, right? I mean, it computes in a particular way, and then to us, we kind of humanize it in order to understand what the thing does. But, if you think for 2 minutes, we all would, of course, immediately say, well, it doesn't really see. It's just a figure of speech. And we expand that to morals, we expand that to politics, we expand that to all the other kind of social components within which we are operating. And I think all that, in a way, is not real, right? And a new kind of real would come out of this. And I think to speculate on that, to me, is one of the most interesting things to do that's in front of us right now. So that, to me, is more the question than the one of incremental improvement in the technology itself.
I think there's also, aesthetics came up a few times, but if you think back, say, people like Robin Evans, projective cast, there's a whole argument about a trajectory in architecture from perspective to projection and what it afforded for what architecture could be designed and made real. And now we have other levels of perception going on. Like if you look at, computer vision is something you can easily rationalize and understand from a technical point of view, but it's still experientially really strange. Like whether you're looking at a QR tag, a kind of pixelated image that has no reference to anything we're used to, or you're looking at a LiDAR scan, or like a friend of mine working on semantic slam, like, a kind of computer vision that can say this is a chair or this is a person. They're just very abstract things that don't seem to have much human kind of engagement or meaning to them. And at the same time, they're opening up perhaps other forms of perception that right now seem to be very dialectical. It's like us and them, you know, like we talk about computer vision being this kind of alien relative to humanity. But I think if you look at a kind of trajectory of any technology, there's no real separation between the technology and the persons per se. So the question I would have is, you know, rather than what is the aesthetic, what is the perception that architecture gains from machine vision?
Or what are the criteria by which we start to evaluate? Because when I walked in, I saw some of these things, and I was saying, you know, that's beautiful. That's really compelling. And I'm asking myself as well, what is it that allows me? Is it the same set of criteria that one used, you know, 50 years ago? I mean, can it even be, or are we fundamentally different because of the way we operate?
It's like, you know, I think I kind of bristled at the random thing for a reason, is that most of this stuff is intentioned. So I think even though the work maybe has a certain amount of difference, it has a cohesion to it that allows you to kind of base a framework of aesthetic judgment off of it. Like, it's not random. It has inherent logic and structure to it that you can begin to apply the same aesthetic analysis techniques on it. Although it is, like with the machine vision thing, I think there's a little bit of, we're kind of at I think a switching point where, like, most of the algorithms that Rob and I have worked with in our offices, and some of the machine vision stuff that we were talking about, I think that the reality is, like, a human designed it to do something specifically for humans, right? Like, it doesn't come from magic place. Someone embedded that machine vision algorithm with its biases. So I'll lean in. It's you know, it has a designer's bias in it already. It already has a human component to its design and its production. But the neural net stuff, like some of the stuff that would be used to actually detect gender, age, like I was thinking when you're doing your story, I was like, age popped up, and I was like, yeah, that's one that they can do. These type of neural nets is a much different framework where we have explicit control over how the algorithm makes its decisions. When you're working with something like with a deep learning neural net, you're giving it a goal, you're giving it a general things to learn from, but the weights are so complex within the interior of the model that we actually don't know how it's making its decisions or how it's making its behaviors, which I think kind of distances that work maybe from the work that kind of you and I have both done. Traditionally,
I'm really happy you bring up convolutional neural nets or neural nets of various sorts, because what I find so interesting about that radio program, it's not a debate about whether or not it should be done or not. I think the debate was, how do we think about this? And why are they doing it? So they can automate it. So their way of thinking about that problem can be turned into a technology that will be how the network will decide. They're trying to embed that expertise of the priest, the philosopher, the politician into software. I think that is ultimately the aim, because it will be happening too fast to ask the priest, the philosopher, or the politician, right? So like any expert system, like for example, a particle accelerator, the expert system, the software is not doing anything other than what an expert human operator would do, except it's happening too fast, right? So as we know from research into vision throughout the 20th century, we see what we're looking for. So what we're thinking is ultimately what we'll end up seeing, right? So I don't think they're actually separate problems. I think AI becomes machine vision and vice versa. So, like for example, we were all fascinated, weren't we, about when Google showed some instances of how to search for images, and all right, let's try to search for eyes, you know? And then it finds eyes in everything. And they're super creepy because it's like images turned into eyeballs, like mats of eyeballs, right? Well, obviously because it's trained to look for that, you know, so what it's thinking becomes what it sees, right? So I think convolutional neural nets and other iterations of this to come, I think we're going to be dealing with some really interesting problems of how do we embed what we know how to do as architects into the software and automate what we know how to do. You know, so and that's why I think it's not a kind of Luddite, technology bad point of view. It's more like how should we think about things so that we can turn it into a technology. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I just you started your introduction and you mentioned Walter Benjamin, and one thing that when I was rereading it recently, it was really interesting that in German, what is being translated in English often as authenticity, in German is he's using a word that is actually more accurately translated as real. So basically, the reproduction, because it takes away the now of the object, is therefore making it unreal, right? And I thought that was interesting, obviously, because some of the recent debates we're having is about the real and, a new kind of real that is upon us and so forth. And, I'm looking at these projects, which, again, by the way, I think they're marvelous. I want to just point that out also for the students who put in the work. I mean, there's really some amazing stuff that I've seen today. The question of a new reel that we are constructing, but unlike the other reels that we've been constructing over time, this one is partially out of our hands. Right, and in a way, right now, it seems we're still being playful with it, right? We're talking about the agency of machines, but deep in our heart, we're like, yeah, we're controlling it, no problem. We're still making it look pretty or cool or weird or ominous, It's like we're completely still in our sort of very humanist categories of thought and judgment and so forth. But it's creeping up on us. And I think, again, going back to that radio show, it just made, to me, I was like, okay, it's creeping up to us. I mean, and that was maybe another interesting moment in that show. So I'm asking myself a lot these days how to think as a designer, right? I mean, the moment you sort of take your head up and you understand architecture is not only about the design object, but, about all these other things that we're reflecting upon as a mirror of our time, where are we going, right? And, so Benjamin's whole notion of authorship and authenticity tied to something that is real, and it loses its realness, and therefore it's a kind of alternative real or a fake, if you will, through reproduction. And if it's true, if this has been accelerating, in crazy speed, I think the question is really central. Where do we find ourselves? I see a lot of talk, and not here, just in general, right, that we sort of collaborate with machines, right? Machines have their sort of bias and way of looking at things, and then we kind of steer them a little bit. I found that incredibly naive, right? I don't think that that's going to cut it, right? I think that the problem and the opportunity is much larger than that. So again, I have obviously no answer for it, but I think that's an interesting question to speculate,
It's not a bad first step, though, I think, to take the tool that's been made for other reasons, and it's at our disposal, and we break it. We break the tool and see what else it can do. I don't think that's a bad way to start, just to see what potential suddenly appeared by breaking it or misusing it, defamiliarizing it. But I agree. I think once that's done, I don't think we can keep looking for new machines to break. But, we got to take some of those possibilities and start running with it, I think.
I think that's a kind of, I think it is a little bit the sort of conundrum of like, all the, most of the things we were using is, as you're saying, misusing some of this technology to produce some other things which are defamiliarizing, but they're also just, when the attitude of the project is not like solving a problem of avoiding a car to crash or delivering this to A, B, but basically just sort of distorting and producing variations of that, maybe to let us see other versions or possible versions of it. I think that and again, I mean, I'm usually a little bit uncomfortable discussing aesthetics, but I think in this particular case, aesthetics is sort of all over it because, I mean, everything's, modernism and different idea of a kind of industrialized machine and, Corbu ideas of machine of living as a house, as a kind of extreme version, and all the kind of criticism of that, or the emergence of the computer, in the 90s, and all the kind of episodes of like what the computers and ways of working with the computer and byproducts of these or ways of making, let's say. And so if the computer can make lines, you would just make lots of lines, and then, that ultimately generated sensibility. If the form of fabrication will make of those lines, groups, suddenly that texture will become a way of sensibility, and you will engage, and the more group, and all those things, we've seen the cycle of these things, and I think, maybe this is another cycle. The question is whether you kind of, you sort of push, and this is where, for me, there is an aesthetic judgment, authorship, and do you push for, and this is a discussion often have in the studio, do you push for the sort of maximalistic approach to like these things, let's say, just because you can glitch something, and this is at the kind of most basic level of a machine vision, you will push for the most overwhelming approach to that, or you will sort of begin to see and discover and measure up other ways in which maybe aesthetics, culture, other forms of predilection, and this is where I go, where I think that the priest and that example is interesting, not because it actually maybe is completely inconsequential overall, but it's important at the sort of cultural level what this thing means and how you actually move beyond the sort of simple cliches of, because we can do lines, we make a lot of lines, because we can do texture, we make a lot of texture, or because we can make, like 1,000 pieces, we make 1,000 pieces,
I struggle to connect the aesthetic with the ethics. I'll get back to the ethics in a second, but from the aesthetic point of view, I thought the work was stunning, like really beautiful. And I think that my aesthetic judgment's obviously clouded in my cultural zeitgeist. And there is a desire right now for a little bit of letting loose and seeing our world pervade with the unfamiliar beyond just the boundary of that site. So for me, the images were really compelling, and any individual building that could be built on the site would never be as compelling as the image because of the fact that the image goes beyond the site and overtakes my entire reality when I'm looking at it. It is rich enough to engage with me in different ways in different parts of the image. From the ethical point of view, I keep thinking about Asimov's 3 laws. And Isaac Asimov wrote these 3 laws of robotics, and then explored through all his writing how to break those laws through circumstances. So all his writing is looking at what happens in this situation and how does that situation cause a conundrum based on those laws. And with the Internet of Things, we have now the increasing amount of algorithms embodied within the real physical world, like to the point where, like a toaster is connected to a fridge might be ordering milk. And so if you were to take the Asimov 3 laws exploration through all these things, there would be a lot of interesting ways to break architecture in a way, or to subvert where decisions are made or where the ethics lies. Does the ethics lie any longer in the floor plan or the figure ground more than it lies in the refrigerator or the relationship between a refrigerator and a pair of shoes? And I think this is a kind of really interesting time to be around.
Well, now that we've gotten just some general conceptual stuff on the table, and that's pretty juicy stuff, I think. Maybe we come back to it, but I think it's maybe good to nerd out for a little bit. And because we're now liberally using the term in our conversation here, machine vision and AI, maybe we could talk a little bit about what do we really mean by machine seeing? Now, Rob, I know you've had to deal with this quite a bit, because in this research project we're using really semi-autonomous drones to deposit material to fabricate things. They have to see each other, and they also have to see a goal, a target, the points in space. How have you been dealing with this? Like, what does like the drone being able to see another drone or a point in space mean? Like, how do you do that?
It's actually a pretty exciting and interesting thing. I mean, it kind of happens at multiple levels. One thing is we're using aerial and ground-based robots, basically mobile robots, but they have to be able to know where they are in the world. So the first thing is they use vision for localization. So knowing where you are in the world, we take for granted, but for robots to coordinate between each other, they need to know where they are relative to each other.
So there's a GPS locator?
So GPS isn't accurate enough. So we use something called SLAM, simultaneous localization and mapping, which is basically vision-based in time, and it's triangulating between recognizable objects in an image, and also sensor fusion. So this is how you just navigate in the world, or you know where you are. But beyond that, we also use computer vision for design tasks as well. So we've been doing things like using object recognition to then directly have robots respond as an embodied entity, in a sense, to respond in the environment they're in to the environment and also what they've already produced. So basically using object recognition, in that case computer vision, to recognize objects, and then basically programming events that take place under the conditions when they recognize those objects. And then the third thing would be just to have, we also have more feedback mechanisms, so that we also use principles like stigmergy, or line following, for instance, which is something you see in ants and termites, where they recognize maybe a path that they've already taken, and then they will retrace that path with slight variation and things like that. So there's kind of, what it means is you end up having, we're very interested in not the things that we can, let's say, make in a predetermined way, but we're interested in the algorithms that are actually embodied within the physical robot and its way of seeing the world, and its also physical capabilities of carrying things out. And I think it becomes particularly interesting when the way they modify the environment in turn affects the way they can modify the environment next time. So for me, computer vision, I guess, it's about embodied robotics, where the algorithms are operating in the physical world.
So, because I was going to ask, like, why is a camera not an example of machine vision? Like,
the camera is, it can be. I mean, like, machine vision is simply, it's a collection of hardware and algorithm that like takes data from the physical environment, and then turns it into like a useful piece of information for whatever you're doing to respond to. So, like, if you don't want a car to collide to something, it just needs to know how far away something is, right? But if you don't want to hit an old person, then you need a convolutional neural network on top of a camera that then says, oh, that's the old guy in the photograph, right?
So I guess both of you are already saying that unless there is some computer-based agency, like some version of it pointing the camera, I mean, that's somehow, like me picking up a camera and pointing it at something, that we wouldn't call that machine vision, right? Just because I'm using a machine.
I mean, I think it's about supplying information for utility. Right. So like a camera in a subway station might not move, but it can find all the faces. That's because we need to know where the faces are. Whether or not it's actually then doing something with the faces or someone else's, like that's all it is just like translating a bunch of hexadecimal integers into old people faces, or point clouds into geometry that I don't want to hit or whatever.
A goal has to be stipulated.
It's essentially interpretation of the data stream from the video, or a photograph or scanner.
So hence, like a surveillance camera, just kind of blindly or stupidly recording things, even though it's automated. Right? It's still not what we would call machine vision in the sense we're talking about, because it's just dumb capturing, even though no one's pointing it.
It's not being analyzed and constructed.
Yeah, I'm just very curious to see, like, what's the threshold where we say, all right, now we're talking machine vision.
Well,
what exactly is
camera's basically a sensor, just a high-resolution one, and then it's about interpreting what it's sensing. And there's more sophisticated ways, like I mentioned before, semantic SLAM, which means it can identify silhouettes and learn what they are. And of course, you know, something you see in computer science, you also see it in philosophy, like this whole issue of an image, like recognizing that this bottle is the same bottle when you see it from multiple perspectives comes into play as well. The question though is, what are you doing with that information, and what's it being used for? And so, for instance, and how fine-grained do you need to be concerned about it? So I haven't written computer vision programs. I've used computer vision programs in programs I've written. But of course, there's many things you could do if you actually dived under the hood of one. But it's hard enough just to train one to do things you want it to do, or you know.
I have a really good one for detecting nipples in Rubens' paintings. I wrote, it's supposed to be for eyes, but I'm not good at writing computer vision.
But the way, I mean, it's interesting to hear you guys describe this, because there seems to be like a kind of quantitative side to this sort of detection, you know, and the fact that, you know, it's based on sensors and so on, and then there is also a kind of qualitative side of it. And I think in the qualitative side of it is where, like, you know, there's probably sort of terrain, I mean, arguably in both, but the qualitative side, it seems to me, at least given some of the examples of some of the work where there's, you know, terrain for exploration, or let's say, or the aesthetics seems to kind of come to the fore more. I mean, arguably they are the quantitative too, let's say. I mean, I went to, you know, when this whole driverless car came about in Tesla, I went to ask, you know, with my, you know, first generation Tesla, hey, you know, this could drive itself as well. Well, yeah, if you pay $20,000 to get all the sensors that the car don't have right now, it's the same car, you know, but it's not the same car. Yeah. So it means like you just have a bunch of sensors in a way, and it's interesting because you know, my car is blind, let's say, and the other one is, and I mean, I don't know. It's interesting that it's just the way you describe it is also like it's like
I'm also interested in the qualitative side, but my investigation's been more into the qualitative effects from robots that have embodied computer vision rather than qualitative effects by directly.
No. I know this wasn't I mean, a criticism. I think it's interesting because just to say what the fact that the difference is not the difference is on some sort of added technology that will sort of help you detect things, you know, which is first a kind of quantitative thing, and then it will sort of obviously make it into qualities and parts, and then from there it will make some decisions, obviously.
But I'm curious also about the goal. Like, is the machine is aware of the goal. You set the goal, you program the machine to be aware that it has a goal, but yet it cannot decide whether that goal is maybe, you know, an ethical decision about if that's a good goal or a bad goal. It has the goal that you give it. So you're still...
In my case, I mean, I think Casey's doing some probably more adventurous stuff, but in my case, I have a hierarchy of event-based or behavior-based decisions that are predetermined. We're about to get into some serious machine learning now. Like, I run a research lab in computer science that's working on this research grant, and some of that work is now looking at machine learning to determine rules or to rewrite rules, because there are a lot of things where we can benefit from that, both creatively and pragmatically. But up till now, most of it has been based on literally kind of iterative human observation and iterative programming, where you kind of program something, qualitatively evaluate it, and then you reprogram it. But we are moving more towards other means of programming. But the emphasis is always on what we're doing, rather than on necessarily the quantitative side that we actually have to engage with to do it. And some of those decisions are really low level, and some of them are very kind of high level, I guess. But yeah, it's an interesting thing, because there's always seems to be more that you see in the physical world than what you've programmed, and there's even more than what your intentions are as well. There's a whole lot of other physical things that just take place.
It is an interesting question also to ask. It's a simple question, but an important one I think we have to ask every 5 years or so if we go along with this, is like, what are we looking to get from this, right? I would assume that all of us here would agree that we're not interested in any kind of, technological positivism, let's say, right? Or efficiency, right? I mean, if somebody disagrees, raise your hand, but it's kind of given that, you do disagree?
A little bit.
Okay,
I'm-
well,
I'm-
we give
I'm
you
a
a
little
chance.
bit- yeah,
Just give me a second. I actually
I'm a
thought you
little
may.
interested in-
There's a touch of positivism there.
Yeah.
touch,
Which is,
smidgen.
I mean, there's something to be said about that for sure. But let me just, my own way of looking at the question of technology, being of the 90s generation, some of us on this panel, when you guys were talking early on about alienation, I mean, to me that rings, very close to home, because when we started in the mid-90s with so-called generative computational software to explore organization, form, structure, and all those kinds of things, at least one branch of that investigation was entirely driven by alienating technology. Right? For instance, why are we using animation software to do architecture? Right? Why don't we use, Euclidean space to do architecture? No, we are alienating, we're using a certain kind of new type of software that is made for film, and we're actually reappropriating it for architecture, and we're getting some kind of weird satisfaction, I guess, that's a desire for
It's
novelty.
a bit countercultural, I think.
Countercultural, the belief to novelty, like seeing something for the first time, or believing to see something for the first time, and then pushing that as a progressive agenda, as a cultural progressive agenda. Is that still something we can do today? So when I hear you guys talk over here, the consensus I'm getting is yes. I mean, that project is still continuing, and it may, right? I'm not sure, but I think the other questions that we were circulating in this conversation earlier on, to me, seems to open up another door, right? Where it is not any longer fully in our control. Maybe it never was. For a fact, it never was, but we believed we were in control. And admitting that there is some kind of emerging agency to the world, and it's not only for technology, it's also obviously what speculative realism is really all about, right? The ability to sort of see agency in the things outside of a direct correlation. That has to register in the way how we think and make architecture somehow, right? I mean, would you guys agree with that?
I would agree with that. I mean, I think I guess I would call that a posthumanism take, and I definitely subscribe to that. Let's say the bar has shifted, and the world is no longer just our world that we kind of conceive of is no longer just our world either. I would say, first of all, I would say I am very interested partially in the generative capacity that we were doing a long time ago purely by algorithm being more physical, but I'm also increasingly interested in being more and more hands-off. But I'm not so interested in this copying repetition that was alluded to before. I can see a future that is constantly reinventing itself, where we're kind of just a participant rather than God, in a sense. And I think that's a pretty interesting future, with lots of problems.
I'm definitely more sanguine about the possibility, because I think it's, from my point of view, it's just an article of faith that we arrive at a kind of spiritual state of the machine, that where novelty is produced perpetually.
I mean, we talked about this
I'm
before.
skeptical of that. Yeah.
Were you I think when you at the final we're talking about Dan and Jose's project about now the residence is tied to computing power, as you were kind of talking about it as a kind of prisoner-slave relationship between the technology and the person. And I again, maybe because of too much positivity, as the kind of Pollyanna of the group, I guess, I see it more as a kind of symbiotic relationship. And I think, to Rob's, I think the kind of to Marcelin's question and what Rob is talking about, and the reason why we insist on a certain amount of literal, getting your hands dirty approach to these kind of things is that when we're talking even just within the range of like intelligent agent algorithms, there's a huge conceptual fall off between things that do what we tell them to do. Like even within learning algorithms, it's like in Russell and Norvig, there's simple reactive, which is like light switches. Most of the stuff that Rob and I have worked with in the past are model-based simple reactive agents. Like these are things that don't learn. And then even within learning, they're always learning towards a specific goal. And then the kind of new territory, and this is, I mean, those kind of arguments about these things being fully, or us being kind of subservient to them didn't really make sense. But the kind of new territory that's been added on to the end of that list lately is these things that can do kind of unsupervised learning or start to evaluate their own worldviews that we can't then reverse engineer. And the reason why, I lost it. So that brings up the question, and like, okay, within those there is
Just
a kind
glitch out.
I fried. There is a kind of ethical question there to their use, but also, you know, as a designer, I think both, you know, as a former employer of his and doing stuff for Cecil, the kind of algorithms that we worked with were all these kind of black box algorithms. And I think because of the cultural shift of this post-digital works of ubiquitous factor, the reason why we need these more sophisticated machines is the kind of information that we have about our world or what we're trying to incorporate in our processes is so complex and daunting that you need another form of intelligence to begin to interpret into something useful.
Do you think that worldview would include a new aesthetic? The machine would actually develop its own aesthetic?
Yeah, I
And
mean,
you would
like,
have to, as a
like
human,
they're already
start to learn from
designing their own languages.
its aesthetic criteria.
Yes. But I think it's...
I want to give you a chance to punch me back.
Yeah, exactly. I want to go back. First of all, I mean, I want to clarify. When I said post-humanism, I'm not referring to transhumanism.
Yeah.
I'm not a transhumanist. So I'm not. Just to clarify. So I wouldn't consider.
I didn't ask you.
No, but I think it was kind of implied in your response.
No,
perhaps.
well, I mean, you're making a case that it will get to a point where the technology will produce novelty.
Yeah, I do think technology will.
And it will be wonderful, you know. And
I didn't necessarily say it would be wonderful.
And you said that as a kind of explanation for why you're not content with the idea of machines being able to do nothing but copy, right? Yeah.
Okay.
And you see, for me, like, I want to take it more kind of neutrally. I'm of the opinion that we can only program it with our commands. You know, it may get so complex we can't trace how it processes all of those commands, but it will always be an action of our commands, right?
I think that ship
which,
has sailed.
in other words, copy what we instruct it to do.
Well,
Right?
Yeah, it's too late.
Yeah.
if you think of if you look at Alan Turing or I mean Alan Turing and John von Neumann, you can't pick much more fundamental basis for computation than these two guys. And both of them are arguing that there is a creative potential in computing beyond the intentionality that they have seated in the programming. I mean, of course, in a very constrained way. I mean, and we all kind of know the limitations of programming at present. Like, I'm not saying that things are going to necessarily drift into some totally creative universe. But what I'm getting at is that I think there is the possibility that at a certain point that we recognize that there is benefit in letting some things coexist with us at a fundamental level. That's what I'm getting at. So I'm not saying that we necessarily cannot intervene, but at a certain point, if you choose not to intervene, then you might find that later on, further down the track, you cannot intervene. Does that make sense? So at the moment, why would we do that? But at the same time, we are kind of
the reason why I want to intervene here, like, just to press the point, okay? Because I think it's really what's at stake. In I think the core premise guiding the research in the program is to make sure, absolute sure, that the author is present, that is, the architect is present, and that the author is producing original work. In other words, the opposite of a copy. Okay? And I think this is why the defamiliarization comes into play, the breaking or misusing of machines come into play. And I think this is a really crucial, like, technological and philosophical and disciplinary question, whether or not these such things can actually produce an original, which is another way of saying a new, or the non-copy, the authentic, right? Because if it does, I don't think you need architects anymore.
I think that there is a. I mean, I think what you're saying is super interesting, and I don't know. I mean, not to kind of take the discussion there. I would be curious to see what you're, when you have people like Elon Musk or people that are like high up the food chain of technology being sort of concerned with some of those sort of experiments and machines getting to be too autonomous. I mean, mentioning the Google experiment to letting the sort of like, Google self-learning tool to like very, very quickly spiral into like sort of hateful speech and reaction to Microsoft.
It's not slander.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I know nothing. I'm just like, reading all these things. But I was just thinking more in the question of like, how you make some of these how you make some of these decisions, in let's say like. I mean, I was recently programming my iPad, and it was like reading the fingerprints, and it was reading particular fingerprints, and it was, let's say, a machine sort of like recognizing something. I don't know whether that's actually you would call that into sort of machine vision or machine recognition, but it's reading certain features, let's say. I mean, in a certain way, it's some form of abstraction when you program this thing that you actually reduce amount of qualities over here for this thing over there to actually recognize, but you can't just make an accurate translation. It's not 100%, let's say. It's not looking at my finger shape. It's not looking at the shadow that could be, it's just trying to perceive certain things. So the point is that at some point, these things, if you kind of like scale up, the aspect of experience get automated to the point that it gets reduced. And, you have this in literature, you have this in mathematics. There's only a certain amount of reduction that is possible, until which you start to kind of lose certain amount of qualities of the original into maybe a copy that is either no longer a copy or is sort of a new version of lesser qualities associated with the original. And I don't know, I mean, I'm not trying to put a kind of romantic spin. I'm probably a little bit like not as positivist as Casey is on some of these issues. I wonder what you guys think about this, this problem.
I mean, I always think architecture, I think, is driven largely by desire, not by pragmatism. And what I mean by that is there is a whole world of building construction that goes on without architects. And so that desire is very human-centric. It's a cultural thing, it's a personal and a social thing. And what I wonder is, even if you were to see more of these Microsoft algorithms being produced, like at what point, like, will we always be engaged? I think this is where it would just keep coming back to us to a certain level. We're always like, I think there's a different argument. I was playing the observer before about these kind of two streams that could eventually separate a little bit. But for our purposes, I think we also are constantly managing or creating our own desires. And I don't know, so for instance, I'm really interested in this work because it obviously impacts me and where we are right now at this juncture as humanity. But, 50 or 100 years from now, I have no idea what would illustrate or create that desire.
Even within, I think this is why I rambled a bit about the different types of agencies. I think even within my own work, like this represents a kind of last generation of stuff, and I think that they're vastly different consequences in terms of the designer. Again, the reason why there's a consistency to all these algorithms is they're all kind of based on my algorithmic design, and I very much see the production of these machines as my design project, or as part of my design project, and I see them as extensions of my authorship. So they are like an amplification.
Yeah, I remember when we talked about this, actually.
But with with the things, some of the things I'm working with now, where I can't necessarily reverse interrogate, or I don't have explicit control over every weight in a network, that relationship changes, right? Like it becomes much more of a kind of partnership. And if we're looking at, and the reason why I'm getting into those things is, again, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that we've been really bad at doing let's just say like inhabiting the world. over our history. Like we're kind of a clumsy, destroying myopic thing. Like our technology is myopic, and I think that the promise of this, let's say, partner or collaborator is it's able to eventually analyze a kind of territory, a level of sophistication that we can't. So it can begin to anticipate consequences in a way that we can't, which potentially could lead to us being able to become kind of a more sustainable or or some other species that has a kind of different relationship with its context. But I also think that it's important to like Nick Cernick wrote an essay pretty recently about why it's imperative that governments start to get in and break up the kind of Microsofts and the Googles, because at that point, like these types of super sophisticated anticipatory, or as these things get more sophisticated, things which define our relationship with our context are owned by private entities, then they're also loaded with their agendas and their biases. So while there's a potential for these algorithms to begin to expand our understanding and our relationship with our context as a species, and I think that goes to architecture too. I think you make an argument that we're at some levels we're pretty bad architects. Like the amount of kind of waste and excess and clumsiness of utility and the amount of turnover, a lot has to do with a kind of clumsiness for understanding what the problem is. So some of these machines are designed to help expose the problem that we're even addressing as a designer. But we need to make sure that they're not exclusively, well, I don't know if we need to, but I would rather not have them exclusively controlled by entities with one specific agenda.
I find, I mean, the conversation's a little bit disconcerting in a little way. Like, I have no problem letting loose something in the constrained environment of the thing I'm working on. Do you know what I mean? And I can see that getting weirder and weirder over time, and I'm very interested in that. But when Casey, when you start talking about kind of society at large, the environment, this kind of thing, I can imagine really different scenarios that could play out with that. Like, I mean, even now I find Facebook very uncomfortable. You know, the whole idea that you have a whole social, I mean, a whole, like a society influenced by algorithms run by a company that are changing the way we feel or our perception of each other and everything. There's a political project there that is kind of scary. The types of things you're talking about, like in terms of maybe impacting how we make decisions, like beyond decisions we make as an individual to, you know, more sophisticated level of decisions. I mean, this could happen in a really scary way from the top down, like basically a digital dictator.
Yep.
It could also happen from a very scarily kind of almost communistic point of view, like a ant colony or something, you know, where there's over dependence on computation and things like that. That, I mean, I could see a lot of scary futures there that I don't really want to get near.
But you know, can I add one thing?
Society comes
Rob, I think, you know, what's interesting to me, and I think what you just said makes me think back to something that David said in terms of the copy. I want to bring this back to the notion of the copy and actually tie it back to the Walter Benjamin notion, which is the fear you're describing or the discomfort you're describing with Facebook. One could say probably that is already being sort of described by Benjamin in terms of the copy losing its here and now and therefore becoming a vessel for propaganda, right? And it can only do that because the tradition and the authenticity, in Benjamin's words, is being taken away from it, and therefore it becomes this other vessel, which is being loaded. Could be good, could be bad, obviously. In Benjamin's context of fascism, it's not good. And then sort of like given out, like in these myriads of ways of influence. And, you know, one could say, of course, it's not as sinister when we talk about Facebook, but the potentiality clearly, seemingly is the same. And if we bring that back to the question of the copy, and then David, you said, you know, well, is there anything but the copy, right? It's kind of what you're insinuating with your last comment. Can there be possibly anything else? Or is it just making the copies more and more complex, and therefore they don't appear to be copies, but they appear to be real rather than fake, right? To me, an interesting question then would be, would it matter? Does it matter at that point? I mean, if the complexity is beyond a certain threshold,
after which we don't recognize anymore? Does it become a new kind of original, right? And I think that's a moment where it's very different how we look at things and how, quote unquote, the machine view looks at it. Because for the machine view, it will be decipherable and therefore copies. For us, it won't, right? There's going to be a bizarre gap between our ability to define something as real or original or fake or copy.
Like the students know my fascination this past year with the rereading of the Benjamin article, the work of RNA, the mechanical reproduction, which we've all read, right? And I first read it like 25 years ago and just reread it now. Relative to what's happening in the political sphere, I find it absolutely prophetic and so much smarter than I had originally thought. Now, I think it's good to just be reminded of a little bit of the critique, you know, because you begin to see like how Benjamin is already anticipating things like Facebook, right?
Right,
That we have a technological or mechanical capability to reproduce the image. And it's becoming easy and easier. And every time it's copied, its aura withers. It gets a little bit more disenchanted, right? So now that we have an infinite capacity to copy, because with digitization, we don't even have bare limitations of what it's like to develop film and things like that, right? Which was still a little bit hard. And now it's nothing, you know? That there's virtually no aura left in the image. I think that's the issue to try to work out, because this isn't good. I think it enables other breakdowns in culture when the copy loses, when the image loses all capacity to have authenticity. I think we get a lot of cultural breakdowns, you know? So what's interesting about this is at the core, I think, is a technological problem, because we've gotten really good at it. And whether it's scripts or, you know, screens or robots or 3D print, these are all copy machines on some sense in this kind of more general analysis of political economy. So,
you know, David, I think, you know, one way to look at it for me is also that in Benjamin's case, he is tying aura to tradition, right? I mean, he's like, the artwork has aura not because only of the here and now, but also because of the tradition it kind of carries forward. I would agree to say that cannot be true any longer, right? I mean, that just we don't live in that world anymore. But if I think very hard to myself, there's a lot of contemporary work in art and photography and architecture, I would say, has aura.
yeah,
without
like
a
a
doubt.
Gursky. I would love to have a Gursky,
Of
but
course,
a real one.
right, yeah. Well,
But it's
real
interesting.
one.
I wouldn't download a picture of a Gursky painting and print it here in the SCI-Arc print shop
No.
and put it on my wall and think I have a Gursky, right?
No.
Like
But
I
it's
would want
interesting because the
Gursky.
aura
Well, that's
is
why you don't-
connected to the human that
I mean,
produced it. But, I mean, the aura in the Benjaminian sense is connected to the human that produced it. A lot of it had to do with craftsmanship, the maker of the wooden stool, as opposed to the, you know, assembly line manufactured steel stool that was then distanced from the maker. And so I'm curious about this, the role of the human agent.
Yeah.
And in the
Yeah,
Gursky
absolutely.
example, Gursky is the one who decides how to frame the photograph. Gursky is the one who takes the photograph, manipulates the photograph. So for you, printing it here would fundamentally change
Yeah.
its
Well, I
relationship
think
to that
it's such
maker.
an important issue, you know, in a school of design where we want to foreground authorship and the originality of the work, and perhaps, you know, that can be questioned too. Maybe it's not entirely a problem of that too. I think that can be discussed.
I think it's, I mean, I haven't read the Benjamin maybe since school, which has been a while now, but I think it's reductive to view these processes as copying. Like, I think it's much more like I mean, it's an assemblage of parts. It's a reconstituting. It's an undermining exercise that then produces something other. And in that way, I think it's more along the lines of like Derrida's double session, where the act of I mean, I don't think it's a reproduction, but the reconstitution produces some other. It's more of a translation of one thing into the next. And if you evaluate that thing that's been translated against the criteria and the context and the you know, where it's coming from, then it's a pastiche, which is problematic. But if, you know, you're taking it as if that translation produces something other, then it's okay.
Yeah,
and I think it does.
But you see, I think what you say is something I wouldn't even disagree with, because to some degree we would say our very own DNA is
Sure.
a pastiche in the exact same sense, right? Like Lynn Margulis points out. Now, the issue is more, I think, the cultural presence of such things. You know, because what you say might be absolutely true, that what an author, a human author might be doing, like what Gursky's doing, and resulting in a work of art that sells for $10 million, is not fundamentally different from, say, what this neural net will produce as an image, right? However, I would be really interested to see if anybody can produce an AI that could produce a work perceived anyway to be an original, so that it could produce a kind of irrational presence on, say, the art market, for example. Right? I think it's an interesting test, you know, within the real marketplace. Does it have enough perception that it's an original? Even though, you know, when you really break it down and dissect it, it's really no different from anything else.
But I think that, I mean, I think it's an interesting point. And I was thinking, like, what makes, you know, like all these things are obviously can be disguised in the kind of general, but then they're also specific in terms of their sort of genre, their discipline. Let's say, you know, either it's photography of existing things, is that they are manipulation or non-manipulation. Ultimately, culture around them has sort of positioned and assigned them value, and that's kind of, you know, going back to your question, is it the mission of the program or to a school at large in a certain level to actually take on this technology and produce original work? I mean, of course, I would say yes, you know. The question is yes, but, you know, and like, what does it mean, original work? What does it mean, like, you know, operating within either a given genre or trying to actually, let's say, the difference between originality and new, you know? The difference between, let's say, making something new, not necessarily make it good, you know? It might be actually breaking a bunch of canons, and whereas original means that you might need to kind of define it within a sort of carefully choreographed setting. Let's say, you know, it's still photography, you know, it's still being presented as photography, and you know, or you assume that it's real, you know, it wasn't carefully manipulated, there wasn't, like, you know, more things, I don't know. I think that context, you know, the sort of culture that we define, you know, is often the sort of review of people around the work, the discussion that happened, these kinds of contexts on larger issues associated with this guy's work or a larger, I think that's actually really important, and you know, to which we will assign values of either copy or original, or how do we actually even say? I mean, I don't know. Like, without knowledge of photography or without knowledge of criticism, I wouldn't know that Jackson Pollock was a great painter, you know. It would have been just like bunch of paint thrown randomly on a canvas if I had no kind of knowledge to that.
You
No,
could probably program the robots to do it.
Yeah,
you could probably do that as well. Sure.
I think that's the exact point. Is it's the criteria within the discipline that defines that, and I worry that maybe we're trying to keep the goal line moving, or I'm sorry, no more. I'm not supposed to use any more sport metaphors, but you know, we keep changing the criteria for what's an original in order to avoid this point, but where in other disciplines it's already been crossed, like within linguistics, like it's happened. The machines, they said, yeah, that's a new language, right?
Linguistics, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, they're able to say, like, yeah, that's a new language that the Google translator invented. Like, that checks off all our criteria. And I think in film, too, it's already, I mean, controversially, but I think already accepted in some territories that threshold's been crossed, that a new piece of film has been generated from like various forms of neural nets and
is it any
image
good?
algorithms. It's
I mean, because I think this is a question that at some point,
You know,
is it original, meaning like, you know,
It's
wow,
it's-
or
it's-
is it like
it's
this is new,
thought-provoking.
but that's like, and again, I mean, I think you have to look at these things.
Yeah, but
But
I
you
think
also
the
have
early,
to kind
early
of
expressionist
begin to,
paintings were kind of
you know-
awful, but then they gained
I mean,
a
I'm not
certain
saying it has to
facility
be,
within
I'm
that
curious.
definition of territory where we start to accept it. So I guess my fear would be that we artificially keep moving what we want to call as architectural originality or innovation just to avoid this consequence of some other intelligence beginning to able to inhabit this territory with us.
But let's just take the example. Let's say there was a successful project designed by no one, but produced by an algorithm, a really novel one produced by an algorithm, and it wins an award. So is the programmer, what's the programmer going to say when they accept the award? You know, it's like, I deserve this, I don't deserve this, this is what I did.
No one deserves it.
No one accepts it, yeah. But, and I guess that's the first question. The second one is the jury. Is the jury the architectural discipline? And then what does it take for a jury to actually recognize the value of something? Then it's back in the human court again. And although the algorithm's written by, at least initiated by someone as well, but I think it's always going to come back, like if it's the architecture discipline, it's coming back again to a kind of cultural and discipline-centric critique.
We're beginning to see, because there's a possibility of technologizing expertise, that there was a problem with the very notion of expertise to begin with. And we just didn't notice it until we got to this point where we can can it, right? Because theoretically, based on the definition of expertise, you should be able to can it. We should be able to make an expert system. We should be able to completely embed into software our judgment, right? If we take it at face value, there's no reason why it cannot be done. Now, they're having a hell of a time doing it. And I don't think yet we have an automated author. It will be very interesting to see if we'll get one. But I think part of the difficulty of automating expertise is we may not have experts to begin with in any sort of reliable way. Right? That it depends too much on culture and politics to define it and relate it, that the moment you embed it, the expertise has already changed.
Yeah, I mean, but I think this goes back into the maybe where well, so like my installation last summer, its design, feasibility, budgeting, documentation was fully automated. But it was, it was with these things where, like you're saying, like I wasn't expert enough to embed enough sophistication into the system for it to produce anything interesting, right? But then that's where these other type of algorithm comes in, which can start to do unsupervised learning, where it starts to maybe identify the problems or the issues within a project that you don't see. And those are very real algorithms. We're kind of clumsy with them right now in architecture for sure, but like they're already being applied in other disciplines.
Yeah, when it just comes to the creative professions, maybe it's fair enough to say that. I think it's really so much more difficult to understand what the goal is. Whereas if we say we're going to have automated medicine, robotic doctor, I could see that because it's practically robotic already, the way you go through the procedure of diagnosing a symptom and a course of treatment. Maybe law is a little bit more difficult. It might be to some degree as creative as architecture, like in interpretations of language. Right? But I don't know. I don't know how we would even begin to put down into a codable manner what we know how to do as architects. The thinking we do. What is that exactly? And if we're to artificialize it, right? Or it may be much easier than we think. I don't know.
I mean, in terms of
I'm curious.
In terms of the general commercial profession of architecture, I guess, people have mentioned that it's heading down the route of a lot of other kind of professions where software that's been licensed is also kind of learning. So basically where you have thousands of employees in big companies working on things, and the software they're using is just learning and recording what they're doing. So you can imagine a scenario where a lot of things that are currently done by architects are not necessarily inventing anything new, but just the replication of that work being done autonomously by software within a very short period of time from now, that will probably alter our profession as much as it's already starting to alter law and other fields. But this doesn't really touch on, I think, the topic you're questioning. I think there's a deeper search that we're involved in for exploring what architecture is and can be. I think it becomes a bit more difficult to wrestle with.
But maybe wouldn't you? I mean, I was just thinking, like, back to your refrigerator example earlier, like, which is interesting because I think, you know, if you think about maybe like sort of three sort of main branches, no, like one would be the impact of sort of automation into architecture, the impact in architecture, the impact that the fact, you know, that you could have a bunch of systems talking to each other in the house, you know, that as you kind of get closer to the house, your house will sort of cool itself. A bunch of things that, I mean, we're not super interested, but these are interesting things, you know. I mean, things that could actually have to do with sort of comfort, with like many things, and might not have aesthetic sort of, you know, dimension. The other one is the automation sort of getting rid of the architect or getting rid of the authorship, or at least taking ground from it. And the third one, which is maybe a kind of minor, but is sort of the consequence for aesthetics, no? And which is maybe the one that sort of much more foregrounded in all the things, you know. And I mean, I don't know, I'm not saying, you know, I sort of value one over the other one, but I think it's interesting. I mean, it seems that so far the discussion has been going more like we're not going to have a job, you know, machines are going to do this thing. I mean, we continue to have discussion with Casey, who wants to convince me that he's sort of, that, like, I don't know, that they're not going to be able to do master planning anymore, that he can write a software that can design all these things. And I mean, I'm super interested in this.
Feasibility studies.
I know he means that.
Master
I know.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, you know, and I'm
It's
not
not that
that,
it's
I know
not-
it's not a humanist me that says
Yeah.
no, you know, it's not that I get, like, I won't get it, and, you know, I might have no job anymore. But anyway, but it's more a question that I don't know, and then maybe it's a question of, you know, enough complexity, enough, like, you know, enough computing power, enough, like, but still, all of those things are still based on reduction. And I wonder whether we're not sort of missing the chunk by these other things that are happening that are more like direct, you know, like instead of worrying about like, well, you know, we're not going to design anymore, somebody else is going to design, or because these things are real. I mean, I don't know, like, you know, it takes like being on 106 degrees to know that, shit, you know, I like to be thinking about the freezer and the AC and all that stuff. You know, I don't want to have to wait like for 2 hours in my house to, but of course that's not like, you know, that's not something we put on a wall, you know, like.
But
And I think
I
part
think
of
to
those
me-
criteria have to do with consensus or dissensus. At what point do we all agree, like we do here every day at SCI-Arc? We sit on reviews, and it's like, yeah, that one works. No, that needs some work. I mean, often there is some dissensus as well.
yeah.
But the question for me would be, if you automate that process of the production, the creation of design, how do you then, is there any need for any kind of consensus anymore? Or, you know, who ultimately then says that's the one, that's right, we go with that.
Well, in the
But that's
North-
kind of like, I mean, that's the question I've been asking for 20 years, right? I mean, even jokingly, I mean, we used to make fun of the question, well, which one is the right one, right? And we'd say, you know, the director of this institution, I remember him saying many times, right? You just know, right? I mean, in spicier language, but I think to me that is also a clear sign that we are still, no matter what it is we are discussing, we are operating fully on this sort of human aesthetic judgmental system that has built itself up, you know, through evolution, right? And we're beginning to, so we're trying to put on something else's clothing, and bring in sort of the dialogue towards some kind of machinic intelligence, right? But when it comes to the moment where we say, why, you know, I mean, what the hell is the point of this, right? I think there's a group of people, and again, those are not people that are here, that would make an argument to say, well, obviously, you know, and that's the positivistic argument in the kind of most dumb way. It's better. It's a better world because it computes faster and more efficiently and da-da-da-da-da. And I would say in the last 20 years, we've seen very strongly a kind of development or evolution from the experimental generative computational approach of the mid-90s towards a complete, you know, kind of corporate, you know, hostage taking of that project, right? And in two ways, right? Both. One direction in terms of a kind of technophilia of the same kind of questions, and in the other, I'd say like the parametricist project is doing the same, and it's kind of expanding it to a kind of a political historical realm, right? As a kind of a second modernism. And it seems to me none of those really get to the bottom of what it is we are basically facing right now. But I think the discussion, I find it really fascinating, but to me it also shows we're kind of at a lack of words, right? But I mean, why, what is it we do with machine vision? You know, let's say we don't even care if it's a matter of a copy or not, or the original or not, or the authentic. I mean, in the end, we are still looking to produce something that awes us in one way or another, right? I mean, we're not trying to cure anything, because otherwise, you're right, be easy, right? For doctors, it's easy to talk about technology. It's much, much more difficult for architects to talk about technology, and we know that at least for 100 years, probably much longer.
Just as a way to wrap up, because we're actually getting close to 7. One thing that I feel like I'm interested in taking away from this discussion today is, let me try this out on all of you, and object if you want. Just as seeing and thinking go together for us, for the human being, the seeing and the thinking ought to go together. They're connected problems in the automated version, say in the computer version. Like listening to the discussion, the more technical discussion about machine vision, that it's not separated really from some sort of encoding of an intelligence principle into the inputs to the sensors. Right? That just dumb recording, just like putting a camera up to something and taking a picture, that's not really what we would call machine vision, even though a machine is, in some sense, doing the seeing. So having it go together with a kind of intelligent agency seems crucial, right? So what I want to walk away with is it seems to be might be actually one problem, machine vision and AI, possibly, or different aspects of one problem. But that there's a really interesting problem in whether or not such technology can actually produce originals. And it seems like that's something that should be pursued.
I would just extend a bit, like Ferda's comment about maybe the subversion of things going in the 90s into the commercial realm. I see that kind of operating more as a neo-functionalism that seems to, and when we talk about things like machine vision and algorithms and the relationship to creativity, I think there's a certain segment of the architecture community that will just assume that as a neo-functionalism, embracing that. I wouldn't embrace that. I don't think anyone here would embrace that. So I think that is where the kind of interesting line is drawn, basically. Once you say it's not a neo-functionalism, and for instance, if we look at medicine or something it's a functionalist agenda. So it's a really kind of objective thing in a way, with a clear goal. We're not in that realm. And so then it becomes a really grey line between what one prescribes, what one investigates, what are the questions that we're addressing, where is the agency in design? Is it in the gesture of Jackson Pollock, the material of the paint of Jackson Pollock, the brush, the mind of Jackson Pollock, and I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer. I don't think we can have a single answer to it. In fact, that's the whole point. I would say is we don't want a single answer to it. So I don't think the copy is necessarily a problem if we're approaching it that way. If we're approaching it from a neo-functionalist perspective, it would be a very scary scenario.
I think just first, so that I can leave on. I don't. People don't think I'm trying to put all architects out of business. I don't want to replace all architects, just some of them. Like for me, like
Been
this
sent
thing.
from the future to kill architecture.
Yeah. Okay. The whole toaster, refrigerator, phone thing to me is actually the most interesting part of this. And teaching with Benjamin Bratton, who also teaches here, he's kind of constant positing is what is the interfacial architecture, or what is the architecture actually responds to the current cultural condition. I actually think we're lagging, like we always do. That's kind of what we do. It took a while for the bourgeois to set up before Kubu started doing democratized plans and stuff, but it happened eventually. For me, I think that these types of say partners in the practice are to help me understand what the potential of that interfacial architecture is, or what is the architecture for the current contemporary state, rather than we're in a state right now of kind of post application or post programming extant models with technology. Like the coolest AI in a house right now is a thermostat, which is, it's a good thermostat. And I think you can make an argument that manipulating the temperature and the climate of an inhabitant is actually a much more kind of dramatic effect on a person's life and occupation and behavior as a form of behavioral manipulation. But I think as within our discipline, we probably would like to acquire other territories within that kind of user-other relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I have no conclusion of this. I think a lot of the problems and questions on David and Ferda and Rob and Marceline, I think, have been great. I still have a lot of questions about, because I think even though I don't practice the thermostat and the freezer and the cooling, I still see it as a sort of, I still see that there's some other things out there that we need to care about and along with the aesthetics, of course, because that's important, but it can't just solely be filtered through the aesthetic lenses, because obviously then it goes back to what you were saying, which is like, how do we make, of course, we have a way of making decisions collectively about and most of the time, let's say, we sort of come to a collective agreement, but those are informed by previous decision, by a value judgment that, we're sort of participate, and we collectively agree and that we participate on that. But if the moment you start having sort of multiple set of value judgments, and then they're complete different ideas and that, and I think as a sort of a program and mission and projects and ideas, and this is maybe the beginning, but we discussed this with Casey over with student work, and David and I had this discussion, it's like how to actually not get rid of aesthetics, but to find ways to sort of limit their agency, limit their impact in design. So some other subjects can exist, associated to technology, pervasive to technology, high-end, low-end, or high-tech, low-tech, that somehow can maybe guide some of the sort of agendas that we collectively, not just in this program, but in many programs, can be doing. I think there's maybe more to do there. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but I think there's maybe some things ahead that we need to look further into that. Based on some of these discussions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just the awareness of the importance of the technology producing originals is so keen, and we know this is important, from the beginning, right? Because schools like this and people like us, we entered into it, not happy that the way to make originals continues to be make it with your hands. That is, it's not real architecture unless you draw it by hand, or it's not real sculpture unless you make it with your hands and a hammer. We know that's bullshit, right? Or just foolish to continue to have that be the absurd definition of originality, right? So we enter into it knowing we have to grapple with technology, but at the service of maintaining and this is easily critiqued from many angles, but to maintain authenticity in the production of architecture. So I think where the program's at right now is, I think it's going to have to burn the candle from both ends and push the technology even further, but also double down on the on why we need to make the originals in the first place, and take it even more seriously, I think. So.
I agree. I think just to add one more thing, we did not talk at all about the notion of utopia, which is kind of interesting, because I thought we would, knowing your interests and how we can basically posit a kind of progressive architecture outside of the realms of the utopian, right? And I've been asking myself how the fiction of utopia relates to the idea of the original. Right, and it seems to me there is a very clear relationship between those two as well, and maybe, you know, that's part of your hesitation. Obviously, you have real hesitation embracing the notion of the original, right? That it is historically tied to some kind of, you know, effort to posit a real outside of the conditions which we inhabit, right? And then, as you point always out, you know, you posit over there, and then it just never can build any meaningful relationships to the here and now, which is exactly also, you know, the thing that, according to Benjamin, gets lost in the copy, the here and now, right? So there's that weird triangulation between the copy, the original, and the utopian project. I don't know, it's just a thing, that final observation, but I think it leaves us certainly at a very interesting place or juncture, or I don't know, you know, and I think, I mean, I'm super interested in this whole program, I have to say, and I think, you know, we got a lot of interesting thoughts in the discussion, as well as talking and seeing the work, but fleshing out what this vision thing really is, aside from the question of the copy, to me is absolutely important, you know, and then really how that filters into what we establish as worthwhile for us to do as a discipline.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to thank the guests, right? Unless you have one other thing you wanted to say, Ron.
It was just on my mind with further thinking. The idea of the copy, like, copying implies that there was originally an original. And I mean, that could be questioned as well. Like, you know, it's been questioned before, you know, whether or not you can actually make discrete statements about particular moments in history, or whether you can just look at history from a bit further away as a continuum. In which case, there might still be the desire for originality, which we need to tease out, but whether that originality is actually like a singularity, or whether it's just some kind of minute continual steps on a continuum, I think is something that probably fits more to the
I think ultimately I would agree with you, like in the long view, the very idea of the original or the authentic, it's fraught, you know? I don't think it's a slam dunk to say there is such a thing, you know? But I think it just our very dependence, or the very definition, I think, of what we do, I think it's almost a prerequisite, I think. I don't think we can be architects of copies, you know, strangely as that sounds. So I think we would also have to question a lot of other things with it, which maybe we should, you know. But I'm not unsympathetic to the point you're bringing up, for sure. But well, I'd like to thank our guests and thank the audience for coming. We have day 3 tomorrow, Design Theory and Pedagogy, where we're looking at a lot of, I guess, issues related to this. You know,
Machine vision?
Huh?
Machine vision?
No, not that part. Yes. But we're going to discuss it from a wholly different point of view with regards to the training and education of an architect. So, anyway, see you tomorrow. Okay.